Swanns Way, starting at page 146, I believe. Leonie, my grandfather, said when we returned, "I wish we had you with us this afternoon. You would not recognize Tansonville. If I had dared, I would have cut you a branch of those pink hawthorns you used to love so much." And so my grandfather told Aunt Leonie the story of our walk, either to entertain her or because they had not lost all hope of inducing her to go outdoors. For at one time she had liked that estate very much, and, too, Swan's visits had been the last she had received, when she had already closed her door to everyone else. And just as when we now called to inquire after her, she was the only person in our house he still asked to see. She would tell them to answer him that she was tired, but that she would let him come in the next time. So she said that evening, "Yes, some day when it's nice out, I'll take the carriage and go as far as the gate of the park." She said it sincerely. She would have liked to see Swann and Tansonville again, but this desire was enough for what strength remained to her. Its fulfillment would have exceeded her strength. Sometimes the good weather restored a little bit of her energy. She would get up, get dressed. The fatigue would set in before she had gone to the other room, and she would ask to go back to bed. What had begun for her earlier merely than it usually happens was the great renunciation which came with old age as it prepares for death, wraps itself in its chrysalis, and which may be observed at the ends of life that are at all extended. Even old lovers who have loved each other the most, even between friends bound by the closest ties of mutual sympathy, who after a certain year stop making the necessary journey or outing to see each other, stop writing to each other, and know they will not communicate again in this world. My aunt must have known perfectly that she would not see Swann again, that she would never again leave the house, but this final seclusion must have been fairly comfortable to her, for the very reason that in our eyes ought to have made it more painful for her. This seclusion was required of her by the diminution of her strength, which she could observe each day, and which, making each action, each movement, a cause of fatigue, if not pain, in her eyes gave inaction, isolation, silence, the restorative and blessed sweetness of repose. My aunt did not go to see the hedge of pink hawthorns, but again and again I asked my parents if she would not go. If at one time she had often gone to Tansonville, trying to make them talk about Mademoiselle Swann's parents and grandparents, who seemed to me as great as gods. When I was talking with my parents, I pined from the need to hear them say that name, Swann, which had become almost mythological for me. I did not dare pronounce it myself, but I drew them on to subjects that were close to Gilbert and her family, that concerned them, in which I did not feel I was exiled too far from them, and I would suddenly compel my father by pretending to believe, for instance, that my grandfather's official appointment had been in our family before this time, or that the hedge of pink hawthorns, which my Aunt Leonie wanted to see, was on communal land, to correct what I had said. To say to me, as though in opposition to me, as though his own accord. No, that appointment belonged to Swann's father. That hedge is part of Swann's park. Then I had to catch my breath, so effectively did that name, coming to rest as it did on the spot where it was always written inside me, oppressed me to the point of suffocation, that name which at the moment I heard it seemed to me more massive than any other name, because it was heavy with all the times I had uttered it beforehand in my mind. It gave me a pleasure that I was embarrassed at having dared to demand from my parents, because that pleasure was so great that it must have required considerable effort on their part to procure it for me, and without compensation, since it was not a pleasure for them, and so I would turn the conversation in another direction out of discretion, out of compunction, too. All the old allurements that I invested in this name Swann, I would hear in it again when they pronounced it. Then it would suddenly seem to me that my parents could not fail to experience these allurements, that they must share my point of view, that they in their turn perceived, forgave, embraced my dreams, and I was unhappy as if I had defeated them and corrupted them. That year, when my parents had decided which day we would be returning to Paris, a little earlier than usual, on the morning of our departure, after they had my hair curled for a photograph, and carefully placed on my head a hat I had never worn before, and dressed me in a quilted velvet coat, after looking for me everywhere, my mother found me in tears on the steep little path beside Tansonville, saying goodbye to the hawthorns, putting my arm around the prickly branches, and, like the princess in the tragedy, burdened by vain ornaments, ungrateful to the importunate hand that with such care had gathered up my hair in curls and across my brow, trampled underfoot my torn-out curl papers and my new hat. My mother was not moved by my tears, but she could not suppress a cry at the sight of my crushed hat and ruined coat. I did not hear it. "Oh, my poor little hawthorns," I said, weeping. "You're not the ones trying to make me unhappy. You aren't forcing me to leave. You've never hurt me. So I will always love you." And drying my tears, I promised them that when I was grown up, I would not let my life be like the senseless lives of other men, that even in Paris on spring days, instead of paying calls and listening to silly talk, I would go out into the countryside to see the first hawthorns. Once in the field, we did not leave them again during the rest of our walk toward Méséglise. They were perpetually crossed, as though by an invisible vagabond, by the wind that was for me the presiding spirit of Combray. Each year, the day we arrived, in order to feel that I was really in Combray, I would go up to find it again where it ran along the furrows and made me run after it. We always had the wind beside us when we went to the Swanns Way, over that cambered plain, where for leagues it encounters no rise or fall in the land. I knew that Mademoiselle Swann often went to Léon to spend a few days, and even though it was several miles away, since the distance was compensated for by the absence of any obstacle, when on hot afternoons I saw a single gust of wind coming from the farthest horizon, first bend the most distant wheat, then roll like a wave through all that vast expanse, and come to lie down murmuring and warm among the same foin and clover at my feet. This plain, which was shared by us both, seemed to bring us together, join us, and I would imagine that this breath of wind had passed close beside her, that what it whispered to me was some message from her, though I could not understand it, and I would kiss it as it went by. On the left was a village called Champieu, Campus Pagani, according to the cure. To the right you could see beyond the wheat the two chiseled rustic spires of Saint-André-des-Champs, themselves as tapering, scaly, imbricated, checkered yellowing, and granulose as two spikes of wheat. At symmetrical intervals, in the midst of the inimitable ornamentation of their leaves, which cannot be confused with the leaves of any other fruit tree, the apple trees opened their broad petals of white satin, or dangled the timid bouquets of their reddening buds. It was on the Méséglise way that I first noticed the round shadow that apple trees make on the sunny earth, and whose silk of impalpable gold, which the sunset weaves obliquely under the leaves, and which I saw my father interrupt with a stick without ever deflecting them. Sometimes, in the afternoon sky, the moon would pass white as a cloud, furtive, lustreless, like an actress who does not have to perform yet and who, from the audience in street clothes, watches the other actors for a moment, making herself inconspicuous, not wanting anyone to pay attention to her. I liked finding its image again in paintings and books, but these works of art were quite different, at least during the early years, before Bloch accustomed my eyes and my mind to subtler harmonies, from those in which the moon would seem beautiful to me today, and in which I would not have recognized it then. It might be, for example, some novel by Saintine, some landscape by Glière, in which it stands out distinctly against the sky in the form of a silver sickle, one of those works which were naively incomplete, like my own impressions, and which it angered my grandmother's sisters to see me enjoy. They thought one ought to present to children, and that children showed good taste in enjoying right from the start those works of art. Once one has reached maturity, one will admire forever after. The fact is, they probably regarded aesthetic merits as material objects which an open eye could not help perceiving, without one's needing to ripen equivalents of them slowly in one's heart. It was along the Swanns Way at Montjuvain, a house situated at the edge of a large pond and backed up against a bush-covered hillock, that Monsieur Vintuel lived. And so we often met his daughter on the road, driving a cabriolet at top speed. One year she was not alone when we met her, and from then on she was always accompanied by an older friend, a woman who had a bad reputation in the area and who one day moved permanently into Montjuvain. People said, "Poor Monsieur Vintuel must be blind with love not to realize what kind of rumors are going around. A man who is shocked by a single remark out of place, letting his daughter bring a woman like that to live under his roof. He says she's a most superior woman with a good heart, and that she would have an extraordinary aptitude for music if she had cultivated it. He can be sure she's not dabbling in music when she's with his daughter." Monsieur Vintuel did say this, and in fact, it is remarkable how a person always inspires admiration for her moral qualities in the family of the person whom she is having carnal relations. Physical love, so unfairly disparaged, compels people to manifest the very smallest particles they possess of goodness, of self-abnegation, so much so that these particles glow even in the eyes of those immediately surrounding them. Dr. Persepied, whose loud voice and thick eyebrows permitted him to play to his heart's content the role of the villain to which his general appearance was not suited, without in the least compromising his unshakable and undeserved reputation as a kindly old curmudgeon, was capable of making the cure and everyone else laugh until they cried by saying gruffly, "Well now, it seems young Mademoiselle Ventoire is making music with her friend. You seem surprised. Now, I don't know. It was old Ventoire who told me just yesterday. After all, the girl certainly has a right to enjoy her music. It's not for me to go against a child's artistic vocation, nor Ventoire either, it seems. And then he himself plays music with his daughter's friend as well. Heaven help us. There's certainly a good deal of music making going on in that establishment. Well, why are you all laughing? They play too much music, those people. The other day I met old Ventoire near the cemetery.
He was ready to drop.
For those of us who saw Monsieur Ventoile at that time avoiding people he knew, turning away when he saw them, aging in a few months, immersing himself in his sorrow, becoming incapable of any effort, whose direct goal was not his daughter's happiness, spending whole days before the grave of his wife, it would have been difficult not to realize that he was dying of sorrow, or to imagine that he was not aware of the talk that was going around. He knew about it. Maybe he even believed it. Perhaps there exists no one, however virtuous he may be, who may not be led one day by the complexity of his circumstances to live on familiar terms with the vice he condemns most expressly, without his fully recognizing it, moreover in the disguise of particular details that it assumes in order to come into contact with him in that way and make him suffer. Strange remarks, an inexplicable attitude, one evening on the part of someone whom he has otherwise so many reasons for liking. But a man like Monsieur Ventoile must have suffered much more than most in resigning himself to one of those situations which are wrongly believed to be the exclusive prerogative of the Bohemian life. They occur whenever a vice which nature itself plants in a child, like the color of its eyes, sometimes merely by mingling the virtues of its father and mother, need to reserve for itself the space and security it requires. But the fact that Monsieur Ventoile perhaps knew about his daughter's behavior does not imply that his worship of her would thereby be diminished. Facts do not find their way into the world in which our beliefs reside. They did not produce our beliefs. They do not destroy them. They may inflict on them the most constant refutations without weakening them, and an avalanche of afflictions or ailments succeeding one another without interruption in a family will not make it doubt the goodness of its God or the talent of its doctor. But when Monsieur Ventoile thought about his daughter and himself from the point of view of society, from the point of view of their reputation, when he attempted to place himself with her in the rank which they occupied in the general esteem, then he made his social judgment exactly as it would have been made by the most hostile inhabitant of Cambrai. He saw himself and his daughter in the lowest depths, and because of this his manner had recently acquired that humility, that respect for those who were above him and whom he saw from below, even if they had been below him until then. That tendency to seek to climb back up to them, which is an almost automatic result of any downfall. One day, as we were walking with Swann down a street in Cambrai, Monsieur Ventoile, who was emerging from another, found himself face to face with us, too suddenly to have time to avoid us, and Swann, with the proud charity of a man of the world who admits the disillusion of all his own moral prejudices, finds in another man's disgrace merely a reason for showing him a kindliness whose manifestations are all more gratifying to the self-regard of the one suffering them because he feels they are so precise to the one receiving them, had conversed with Monsieur Ventoile for a long time, although he had never spoken with him before. And before leaving us, he asked him if he would not send his daughter to play at Tansonville some day. This was an invitation which 2 years before would have incensed Monsieur Ventoile, but which now filled him with such feelings of gratitude that he believed he was obligated by them not to have the indiscretion of accepting it. Swann's friendliness toward his daughter seemed to him in itself so honorable and so delightful a support that he thought it perhaps be better not to make use of it, so as to have the wholly platonic pleasure of preserving it. "What a charming man," he said, when Swann left us. with the same enthusiastic veneration that causes bright and pretty middle-class women to be awed and entranced by a duchess, even if she is ugly and foolish. What a charming man! How unfortunate that he should have made an entirely inappropriate marriage. And then, since even the most sincere people have a streak of hypocrisy in them, which makes them put to one side their opinion of a person while they are talking to him, and express it as soon as he is no longer present, my parents deplored Swanns' marriage along with Monsieur Ventois in the name of principles and convention which, by the very fact that they joined him in invoking them as decent people of the same stamp, they seemed to be implying he had not violated at Montjuvin. Monsieur Ventois did not send his daughter to Swanns' house, and Swann was the first to regret it. For each time he left Monsieur Ventois, he remembered that for some time now he had had a question to himself about the person who bore the same name. A relative of his, he believed, and this time he truly had promised himself not to forget what he wanted to tell him when Monsieur Ventois sent his daughter to Tansonville. Since the walk along the Méséglise was the shortest of the two that we took out of Cambrai, and since because of that we saved it for uncertain weather, the climate along Méséglise was quite rainy, and we would never lose sight of the edge of Roussainville woods, in the thickness of which we could take cover. Often the sun would hide behind a storm cloud, distorting its oval, yellowing the edges of the cloud. The brilliance, though not the brightness, would be withdrawn from the countryside, where all life seemed suspended, while the village of Roussainville sculpted its white roofliness in relief upon the sky with an unbearable precision and finish. Nudged by a gust of wind, a crow flew up and dropped down again in the distance, and against the whitening sky the distant parts of the wood appeared bluer, as though painted in one of those monochromes that decorate the pier glasses of old houses. But at other times the rain, with which we had been threatened by the little hooded monk in the optician's window, would begin to fall. The drops of water, like migrating birds, would take flight all at the same time, would descend in close ranks from the sky. They do not separate at all, they do not wander away during their rapid course, but each one keeps to its place, drawing along the one that comes after it, and the sky is more darkened by them than when the swallows leave. We would take refuge in the woods. When their flights seemed to be over, a few of them, feebler, slower, would still be arriving. But we would come back out of our shelter because raindrops delight in leafy blanches. And when the earth was already nearly dry again, more than one would still linger to play on the ribs of a leaf, and hanging from the tip, tranquil and sparkling in the sun, would suddenly let go, slip off, and drop from the entire height of the branch onto one's nose. Right.